This is Concours Judging of Mercedes-Benz Autos, and let me go to the agenda here. So the agenda is basically why we teach it, and then a review of the new rule book changes. And we'll talk a little bit about what we expect from entrants, what we expect from judges, and then we'll talk about scoring, the difference between show category versus street category, and we'll go through the pieces of the scorecard and talk about the areas that you often see deductions, and then a few examples of how to score them. And then we'll have at least one break in there before that quiz, and then we'll have a quiz. And the quiz will be open book. You can use the score sheets. You can use the rule book if you want. And we'll just talk about each of the answers after the quiz. The quiz is designed to be a learning experience as well as a test of your knowledge, but it's designed to make you make a decision based on what you see. So, why do we teach this course? Well, I think that Concours is an important thing for a single mark car club. And you should expect that if you go to a Concours here at Peachtree or go to Concours in Indianapolis, that the judging should be about the same. Your car would get about the same score. So it's to standardize the judging process, and the judging process should be as objective as it can be. And of course, the hardest thing about putting on a concours is having enough judges. And so, we're trying to build a cadre of judges so it becomes easier to do a concours. Now, and I'll mention, since we were talking about Porsches a little earlier, if you're familiar with PCA concours, I'm a PCA concours judge as well. PCA concours rules are significantly different. So do not, think that it's going to be the same as that. So, what are you going to learn? These items here on the slide. And once we get through the quiz, I will have a list of people that went through that, and we'll send that to the National Business Office for your certification. Now, be confident, be consistent, be fair. And consistent is really, really important. Now, and I'll talk about consistency a lot, but the reason for this course is really to give you the rules to make sure that our judging is consistent. And, why is that important? Well, it's important for our contestants, our participants, to feel like they've been fairly judged. Think about, I like to think about the Covey principle of begin with the end in mind. What are you after in a concours? Well, at the end of the day, you want the scoring done in a reasonable time so you can have your scores and awards ceremony done without people waiting forever. You want essentially to have no ties. You want the best car to win in each class. But bottom line, you want the folks that participated to feel good about it so that they come back, especially the entrants. And so think about that as we go through the course. That's what we're after. And consistent judging is important to make entrants feel like they've been treated fairly and want to come back. And the basic learning points are going to be: 1, be consistent, and 2, take points off commensurate with the allocation of points on the score sheet, and 3, in most places, half of the scoring is authenticity and half is condition. And you're going to have areas that you're more comfortable with than other areas, but you're qualified to do all of the areas. One of the outcomes of going through this course too is you become a lot better at evaluating cars for potential purchase. And of course, I want you to have fun. Now, the references, the Concours rule book, which we just revised, and it's on the national website, and the scoring sheets are in the rule book. And I asked you to download the rule book and have the scoring sheets available to you. Those of you that have done this before will notice that the score sheets are essentially unchanged from previously. So there's no great shift in the way we're scoring. All right, so let me talk a little bit about what we changed in the new rule book. One of the major things we did is we reorganized the information for ease of use. We tried to eliminate redundancy. We tried to make it easy to find what you needed to find. So we put street category items in street category. We put show category items in show category, and we put items that applied to each of the categories in another spot. So hopefully you'll be able to find what you're looking for. and it's actually considerably shorter than it used to be, and I think easier to use. We added this discussion of, what I call on-ramps to concours. We want to promote concours. We want people to come to concours. We want to make it easy to get onto the showground. And so we included a discussion of something maybe less than concours that might get people's feet wet. We called it show and shine. Peachtree did this in our last concours and it worked out very well. It was something less than concours. We included a very generic score sheet for it, and it's pretty admittedly objective, but the intent was to get people onto the show field, let them see concours, and then maybe want to take the next step into the concours. The other on-ramp is custom. Now, custom class or category has always been in the rule book, and we actually didn't change anything about custom. But I want to emphasize it and actually put a scorecard in for custom, consistent with the rules. Now, custom is for cars that have modifications, and authenticity isn't judged in custom. There are a lot of especially younger demographic folks that have modified cars, and in the past, there really hasn't been a place for them other than in this custom category, which we have not emphasized. So I encourage folks that are going to do concours to include the custom category to welcome more people into concours. We also included a discussion of junior judges. We've seen that at some of the Haggerty events with the Haggerty Junior Judges Program. You have to grow your future members in some way, and that's kind of one way of doing it. Okay, category versus class. It occurred to us that we were using the word class in a potentially confusing way. We had these 21 classes that the cars went into, but we also had things that we were calling show class, street class, custom class, and silver car class, silver star class. And so we decided to call those categories just to avoid dual use of the word class. So now I'm going to try to be consistent, but show is a category and street is a category instead of a class. And we have 21 classes as we pretty much previously had. Now, the other weakness in the previous rule book is the classes stopped at about 2010. And so if you had a more modern car, it wasn't clear where the car should go as far as classes. And so now we have classes that include cars up to the newest cars. And John Bernardi worked tirelessly on that. Notice also the format has changed into a spreadsheet format that I think is a lot easier to use than the previous version. Now, we clarified a few areas that were always kind of up for discussion. There was always a debate of, well, how much do you take off for a very nice looking top that isn't original in that it doesn't have those little Mercedes symbols and the embossed wording in the plastic piece? And so we just decided, okay, we're going to take a quarter point off for that. And, we became very clear about, if there's no spare on the car in the class, or if some of the cars in the class have batteries in the trunk all covered up, then we don't judge any of the batteries in that class or any of the spares in that class. We also decided to specifically allow some dealer installed options. In my experience, over half of the R107s have pinstripes, and they didn't come from the factory with pinstripes. They were installed by the dealer for perhaps a little extra profit margin. So we decided to not penalize pinstripes on R107s.
Gary, Gary, I'm going to break in here because we had a question in chat from Nancy about wondering why this rule change.
Which one?
About the pinstriping. I'm wondering why only the R107 is now exempt from pinstriping deduction when most U.S. market MBs from the 70s and 90s were pinstriped by the dealers before they were purchased by owners. It's unfair to deduct for pinstriping.
It was very common, Gary, throughout that period. I actually talked to a friend of mine at the Classic Center, and that's what he told me, that all the U.S. dealers back in that time frame, they all had their local pinstriper. Both of my W201s that I purchased brand new were both pinstriped when I purchased them, so it was already on there. And I think to deduct for these cars during this time frame is wrong. It shouldn't just be the R107. It was very common throughout all the models. You can go from, 116s and 123s all the way up to 124s, 126s, 201s. I've even seen a few 202s that were pinstriped, and it was very common. And it's just a quirk of the US market. And I don't think it should be a deduction. It should be across the board.
Well, in my experience, what I see is 107s with pinstripes, but that's a very good comment.
My car actually got a deduction. I was very blessed, and it still won its class, but I think it's a point because, we allow the European cars to not be deducted for the various differences that they have with the US cars, and it's true for the cars from Asia. I don't think we should be singling out pinstriping for the US cars.
Well, I'd also say that the head judge in a concours has the ability to deviate from rules as he needs to
But I think it should be across the board. If you're going to do it for the 107, you got to do it for everybody, because I'm sure I won't be the only one that'll raise this objection.
Well, we'll consider that in the next revision to this.
Yeah, Nancy,
Okay.
thank you for your comment. Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't even
Yeah,
thought of that.
it's an issue.
Okay, I'll just take a note of that. And John's listening as well. The other dealer option, now we've allowed dealer installed air conditioning on pagodas, but it was never in the book to do that. So we actually wrote it in the book. And there's some other things we added for consistency with current practice. We've been training and teaching that we always judge convertibles with the tops up, and that convertibles have the option to show with the hard top on instead of the soft top up. And so we actually put that in the book. The 50-50 split between authenticity and condition wasn't actually in the book, even though we've been training on it and doing it that way for quite a long time. So we put that in the book. And the notion of giving the entrant the benefit of the doubt. We've been doing that for a while and training on it for at least as long as I've been giving the training, but it wasn't in the book. So now it is. And just some miscellaneous additions. We specified SUVs with the trunks behind the back seats. In show, not that I've actually seen this, but in show category, you won't be penalized if you have a non-street legal car and you tow it to the concours. In street, and I had never thought about this, but if you're making the special additions of points for cars that have high mileage, if you have a 5-digit odometer, how do you know how many miles the car's gone? So we added a mention of how to handle that. And we just added the red transmission cap lock tabs being okay. One of the other pieces is that we added a protest procedure. The previous book referred to another section in the book that had a protest procedure that really wasn't very applicable to concours. And so we basically established a procedure which has a $30 protest fee, an hour time limit for protesting, and specifies that the decision of the chief judge is final, and specified there's no fee to protest which class you were placed in. Now, honestly, I don't expect to see protest. I've never seen a protest, but since there was a slot for it, we decided to throw one in there. We also added a discussion of computerized scoring. And what we've been doing in Peachtree is using something called Car Show Pro. And Sam Camber, our concours chair, took the time to write into their software, essentially, the scorecard, which was very laborious. And, I really think computerized scoring is the way to go. I will tell you that there's a lot of growing pains using that type of software, and I'm not sure that's what we'll always be using. There are some weaknesses in the way that doesn't get stored on your computer, so that you end up sometimes losing information if you drop connectivity. You end up working around that by sending your scores pretty frequently. But the advantage to this is not so much for the judges. There are some advantages for the judges, but the real advantage is at the end of the day, when you're tabulating the scoring, you don't end up spending hours trying to write little pencil numbers up on a score sheet and tabulate them. As soon as the judging is complete, you have the answers, and that enhances your ability to get an award ceremony done and not have people just waiting around forever. And so I really think it is the way of the future, although what we're using right now, Car Show Pro, may not be. But the discussion says basically if you use computerized scoring, you need to use a scorecard that is pretty much like the paper scorecards in the areas that it uses and the scores that are on it. So that's really kind of what's in the new rule book. Now, I also forwarded a change summary when I put out the links and the new rule book. And I encourage you to read the full change summary. I haven't covered quite everything there, but I've covered the significant points. And I tried to make the rule book as easy to use and to read as possible. And the text part of the rule book is only 13 pages long. So I encourage you to just read and digest the whole thing. See if you like it. Give us any feedback. I'm sure we'll be, looking at it over the next year to see if we like the classing structure and whether we wanted to change any of the cars from one class to another. But so John and I and Pete will be listening to your input on that. Okay. Any other questions? Do we have other questions on this issue, Diana?
I have one other question.
I'd really like you to chat the question so that we can pretty quickly get through it, but go ahead and ask.
I have one.
Diana, you're muted.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
Nancy,
Go
Nancy,
ahead,
go
go ahead,
ahead.
Nancy. Go ahead, Nancy.
I have a question. I don't know if this is the right place to ask this or not, but I'm noticing with my model, and I guess it's happening across the board, that increasingly the original MB parts are no longer available. I had it happen last year with the radiator for my car. I was able to find a bare radiator, which was the original equipment manufacturer for my W201 radiator, but it doesn't have the MB star on it. Is that going to pass muster, or would that be a deduction? Because this is happening more and more. And I think we're going to run into this as an issue more and more. Where
I think we
there's
probably-
absolutely no
we'll
MB
call-
part.
I think we'll call that original equipment manufacturer part, and I think that'll be fine.
Okay, all right, that was a question I had where somebody just goes out and deliberately buys an aftermarket part instead of doing either the MB or finding the OEM manufacturer. Okay, thanks for clarifying that, Gary. That's a big help.
Well, and I had a question about that the other day about, well, how do you find parts for the cars? And that's really off the topic, but I was thinking about doing an article about my experience in finding hard to find parts. But let me get back to our topic here.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thanks for answering the question.
All right, let's talk about what we expect from the entrants. Well, the first thing we expect from the entrants, and why do I cover this? One, because judges need to know what to expect from the entrants, and two, a lot of the judges are entrants. So, we are training ourselves as entrants too. We expect entrants to arrive early, so they're getting there and being situated to be ready at the designated start time. We expect them, if we're using paper forms, there's a header to fill out. So we expect them to fill those out. And there's typically a time where we say stop cleaning. So we expect them to stop cleaning at that time and be ready. And take seat coverings and floor coverings out, except on cars where they're clipped in or something. If you leave it in the car, I'm going to judge it. And so if you don't want to judge, take it out. And very important, remain near or have an exhibitor staying close to the car. It's very frustrating as a judge when you're trying to find the person to present the car and you can't find them. So that we really expect entrants to stay near the car. We expect entrants to stand back when the judging begins, kind of out of the way, available close enough for questions, but not really within earshot, so that judges can kind of talk amongst themselves a little bit without being overheard necessarily. And we also expect not to have gimmicks, posters, magazine articles about the car. And when I see something like that, I'm thinking, well, they're trying to hide something. If I were a contestant and I did that, I'd probably cover the crack on the dash with a magazine article, or cover a stain in the trunk carpet with some posters or something like that about the car. And so if you see that, you have to ask the entrant to respectfully remove them so we can actually see the car. And the other thing we expect is to not remove the vehicle from the judging grounds until the show's over. And not only are we judging the cars, we're also showing folks what our cars look like, and there's often non-members that are walking around enjoying it, and we want them to continue to enjoy it. But also, if you try to move the car when there's a whole bunch of people walking on the field, then it becomes kind of a safety issue. And so we expect the cars to stay there till the show's over. Okay, so for judges etiquette, what do we expect from the judges? Well, first we expect the judges to introduce themselves to the entrant, and we expect you to thank them for bringing their vehicle. Now, very importantly, and very different from PCA, judges do not touch the car. Judges don't get in the car. You don't have to get in the car to do the interiors. You don't open the doors, hood, or the trunks. You ask the entrant to do that. And there's some simple reasons for that. One, we don't want to leave our fingerprints on the car, but we also don't want to be damaging the car in any way. And the best way to not damage the car is to never touch it. We also expect you to dress such that you don't have metal on the front of your clothes, on the front of your body. Don't have loose things that can fall in the car. Slide your belt buckle to the side so that you just don't have anything that might inadvertently touch the car and scratch it. Now, if you have to ask the entrant a question, the team leader should do so. When might you ask the entrant a question? Well, you might ask about the options or the color or the mileage. Now, if there's a doubt, give the entrant the benefit of the doubt. It's also possible for the team leader to review the findings before moving on to the next car. Now, honestly, I find that I'm always pressed for time. And so, I don't do that at that time, but I'm glad to talk to any of the entrants afterwards about what we found. Now, one exception to that is if you see a safety issue on the car, tell the entrant immediately. It's important to point out any safety issues. It's very useful to walk through the field prior to starting judging to get a feel for the competition. There's a number of reasons for this. Consider you have a line of 107s. 107s, the older 107s have the battery in the engine compartment, and the newer 107s have the battery under a cover in the trunk. If you have that mix of cars, you've got to say, oh, I'm not judging batteries. You also have to look, are they all presented appropriately? If you have some convertibles and some hard tops, you got to be judging the convertibles with the tops up. And so, if they're not all up, you have to ask them to get the top up. Antennas are that way. If you see some radio antennas up and some radio antennas are down, either you're not judging radio antennas or you need to get them all in the same position. The other piece of this is don't start with the best looking car. You can't prejudge them, but don't start with the best looking car. What I found is that if you start with, the car that's perfect, when you get to the third car and you're seeing things on the third car, deficiencies here and deficiencies there, then you think, did I look at that on the first and the second cars? If you start with a car that has more deficiencies on it, you'll look in all those places, and then you'll develop the pattern of looking in all those places on all the cars. And so, if I could know which car was the weakest car, I'd start on that one every time. You don't know that, but that's just kind of a thought. The other piece of that is if we're doing undercarriages, chassis and undercarriage, consider doing the lowest car first. I say that because, to be fair, you have to judge the same things on each car. The lowest car will be the car that you can't see the bottom very well. And so you judge what you can see on that car and then limit your judging on the other cars to what you could have seen on the first car, to be fair and consistent among the cars. Okay. So there's a couple ways to organize teams. And what we've always taught in the past is generally a separate team for each area. That is, engine compartment would have a team, the interior would have a team, the paint and coach work would have a team, and so on. And then you have a leader and maybe an observer, maybe a scribe. And that means you have to start in different places because there's only typically one score sheet and you can't be interacting with the score sheet at the same time. So the engine compartment folks may start on one end of the field, and the Interior may start at another end of the class, and so on. And that's kind of the way we've always done it. I prefer what I call the non-traditional team or simultaneous judging, where you have a team of 2 to 5 people that judge the car simultaneously. Now, the computerized scoring allows you to do that, because if each person's scoring with their iPad or their iPhone, you can concurrently interact with the scorecard. If you're not doing computer scoring and you want to do this, you can make 5 copies of the scorecard, or break out the scorecard so that each of the pieces are on separate pieces of paper. This is how PCA does it, and it's quite efficient. One of the advantages to this is you only have to find the entrant once instead of finding the entrant 4 or 5 different times, and that can really be a pain. And it can be a pain for the entrant too, because they have to hang around by the car until 4 or 5 different teams have gone through the car using the traditional method, whereas you only have to see them once using this method. Now, there is one potential area of conflict in that the paint and coachwork judge needs to see the car all closed up so he can judge the gaps. And the way you do this is, first you have the paint and coachwork judge look at the car closed up, judge the gaps, and then say, okay, ask the entrant to open everything up, and then you just do all the rest of the judging. So, and that's really the way I like to do it. If I'm head judge, that's the way I organize it. Okay. Any questions so far? I don't have my chat window up.
Yeah, just some comments. We're good.
Okay. All right. So responsibilities of the judges, of course, do what I just said. But you have to absolutely evaluate your assigned area, and only your assigned area, objectively, deduct for the actual flaws and nothing else, know the rules and the criteria. It's really useful to know the score sheet. And that's why I have this open book policy, have a score sheet out in front of you, because you'll need to refer to the score sheet a number of times during this presentation. And of course, you'll be referring to the score sheet the entire time you're judging the car. Stay within the scope of your judging responsibilities. That is, stay within your area. That means no cross-judging. We'll come back to this, but cross-judging means that, if you're the engine compartment judge, don't pay attention to the interior. If you see something wrong with the interior, ignore it. Don't go off and tell the interior judge. Don't go off and tell another judging team. Stay focused on your area. Now, why? For consistency. We need the same eyes to look at the same things from car to car in a class. We can't have them being contaminated by other sets of eyes in there. Consistency is really important with this judging. So stay within your area. Don't try the cross-judging thing. And of course, watch the clock so that you get done on time. Some organizations actually have a timekeeper and have a set period of time to evaluate the car. And 4 minutes, 5 minutes. And if you do that for every car, it's a very fair way of doing it, and it helps you get through your field. And almost every time I've ever judged, I've felt time pressure. You have a certain number of cars. The head judge gives you a time that you need to be done by. And of course, you divide the number of cars by the time to figure out how much time to spend on per car. And it's still often very challenging. And of course, give the entrant the benefit of the doubt. I went to a concours judging school one time, not in this organization, where there was an emphasis on, kind of getting the entrant, finding the oolies. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to objectively judge the cars. We want the entrant to feel welcome. We want the entrant to feel like they've been judged fairly. Don't go after oolies, just be consistent from car to car. Now, what if you have a doubt about authenticity? Well, first, you give the entrant the benefit of the doubt. Talk to your judging team member quietly to not be overheard. The your judging team lead may ask the entrant, may go ask the chief judge, but give the entrant the benefit of the doubt. Now, don't judge if you can avoid it, don't judge a close friend's car or a car that you're very familiar with. The real requirement, though, is that you can't judge a class that your car is entered in. You can't judge your own car. That's absolute. That's absolute. And write down what the deduction is for. For every deduction you make, write down what it's for. That's really important for transparency, and so that our entrants can understand what the deficiencies were and what they have to improve for the next time. And if you have an entrant that's trying to ask you too many questions, just politely ask them to step away and until we're finished, and then allow them to address you. It's conceivable that a person could be trying to distract you from doing your job well. And it's pretty easy to be distracted. So be tactful, but ask them to stand aside. And of course, I mentioned the gaudy displays. You see these at Cars and Coffees, and they're perfectly fine for Cars and Coffee. They're perfectly fine when there's a people's choice, but not for Mercedes-Benz Concours. And you don't go back to a vehicle except under very extreme circumstances. You never go back to a vehicle to change a score or to rejudge it, which really means that you gotta, for the first car, you've really gotta get it down right and make sure you look at everything you're supposed to look at. And of course, I said no cross judging. You don't ask another team to make a judgment for you. This is a consistency issue. If in doubt, ask the chief judge. And never, never, never hold little informal meetings where the entrant can hear. Especially don't be putting down the car where the entrant can hear it. We want them to come back. Remember, we want them to come back. So they've got to feel like they've been treated fairly. And I had one where I just commented to the owner. I was doing paint and coach work, and I didn't even take off for it. It was a 98 SL 500, and it had an AMG badge on the right side of the trunk, which is not correct for that car. And if I'd been more tactful, I probably would have asked about the AMG badge. I was not as tactful as I probably should have been, and said, hey, that's really not supposed to be on there. And I mean, he went up, complained to the club president eventually. It was fairly nasty. I didn't even take off for it. So just remember, some people are going to be really kind of excited about what you say about their car. So be very sensitive to what you say. Okay. And I mentioned already, don't go off and tell another team something else you saw. And, don't engage the irate entrant. Leave that to the chief judge of the concourse chair. We've seen irate entrants before. I saw one where he entered Silver Star Preservation and was unhappy they didn't get judged for competition, and they were quite irate. But that was a challenge. You can't judge your own vehicle. You can't judge the class that your own vehicle is in. And I come back to above all, be consistent in your scoring. And an awful lot of these rules is based on being consistent. So let me give you some thoughts about consistency and how to achieve it. Now, consistency means taking off the same amount for the same deficiency in the class. It also means judging cars in the same condition. Top up or top on, windows up. I mean, you've got to judge windows up because you've got to judge the glass. Judge the same characteristics. Battery is in the engine compartment section of our score sheet. Some cars have battery in the trunk. You can't then judge the battery in the engine compartment if it's in the trunk. So you don't judge any batteries in that class. Spare tires are that way as well. Some cars don't have spare tires. Judge in the same order. Now, I like to use the score sheet as a guide and go down the score sheet in order. One of the things I like about the computerized scoring is it kind of forces you to do that as it comes up on your iPhone or iPad. Also, judge in the same manner. For me, that means have a consistent set of movements and have a consistent set of places where you put your eyes. If I'm doing engine compartments, I would typically stand on the driver's side of the car, look over the things I need to see from that side, move to the center line front, look at the things I need to see from there, and then go to the passenger side of the car and look at the things I need to see from there, and pretty much put my eyes in the same place to try to be really consistent. One of the things I really worry about is the idea of getting to car number 3 or car number 4, seeing an efficiency, and then going, did I look at that on cars number 1 and 2? And if the answer is no, you don't take off for it, for that or any of the rest of the cars. And that's why it's really important to be thorough and look at everything you need to look at for the first car and the second car and the third car. Okay. Now we'll transition over to talk a little bit about our score sheet. We have a 100-point score sheet. So a perfect car is going to have 100 points. And that's for both street category, show category. It's actually true also for custom category. We make deductions in quarter-point increments. We don't use decimals if you're writing. We use 1/4 to make it easier to see what we mean. And there are 5 categories we judge in show category: paint and coach work, interior, engine compartment, lights, glass, rubber, and chrome trim, and chassis. Now, chassis is only judged in show, which is show is kind of the full concours. Street is kind of the something a little bit less. In street, we don't judge the chassis. In street, we use those 8 points that would have been chassis are used for mileage and age. We give cars extra credit essentially if they have a lot of mileage and if they're older. So for the 100-point score sheet, in most categories except for paint and coach work, the emphasis is on authenticity and condition. There's a separate line item in there in the score sheet for dirt and corrosion, but there's only on the street category score sheet, there's only 6 points in the whole score sheet for dirt and corrosion, and the show category only has 7. So it's not about who has the cleaner car. The emphasis is on authenticity and condition. I will tell you though, that dirty cars don't win, but because the competition is usually pretty steep. So authenticity and condition are combined with each line item for each category. So if you see a category that's a 2-point category, it's 1 point for authenticity, 1 point in condition. And you have to think that through as you're deciding how many points to take off. I will give some examples of that. Once you get the thought process together, you'll be able to do that pretty easily. And, you know, we had this question earlier about the radiator. Mercedes-Benz authorized factory replacement parts are acceptable, and original equipment manufacturer parts should be acceptable. The non-authentic parts, you know, Euro, other brands of parts are certainly not acceptable. So just going over the score sheet, and you've got it in front of you, so I'm not going to belabor this. I will point out that engine compartment, most everything is one or 2 points. Paint and coach work, most everything is 1 or 2 points, but notice paint imperfections, 5 points, coach sight lines, panel alignment, 4 points. And it shows that those are pretty important pieces. And quality of body work is 3 points. Interior and trunk, most things, 1 or 2 points, except seat coverings, 4 points, which kind of works out to 1 point per seat. Dash instrument controls, there's a lot of things in that one, and it's 3 points. You have to be very careful because there's so many things there to take off for that you don't take too many points off. And headliner and sun visors are 3 points. In glass lights, chrome, and trim, the grille and front bumper guards are 4 points. Everything else pretty much is 2 points, except for the door seals, trim, and handles. And in chassis, which is only in show category, it's only a total of 8 points, and everything's 1 point. And I really like to encourage people to just go ahead and enter in show. Now, in show, the car has to be 25 years old. There seems to be quite a reluctance to enter that because of chassis. Now, you notice there's only 1 point in there for dirt and leaks. And on a lot of cars, you can't even see a lot of that stuff. And so they're certainly not going to be penalized if you can't see them. So I really like to encourage people to enter chassis, enter show, so that chassis is judged. And for those running concours, I like to encourage them to actually judge chassis. You know, in Peachtree, sometimes we just haven't judged chassis and given the show cars 8 points. Now, if you're the head judge and you're going to judge chassis, you might think of something like bringing a whole bunch of cardboard so people can conveniently lay on the ground beside the car and not get dirty. I usually bring a pile of that when I do that. Okay, so you've got the scorecards
Gary.
in front of you, so I'm not going to belabor these.
Gary, before we move on, can you just like roll back to, we've got a couple of questions here.
Okay, where do I want to roll back to?
Let's go back to street paint and coach work, okay? And then Bob
Here?
will get, yeah, we've got a
Okay,
question.
what's
The question is on street paint and coach work. Is the line for fitment of grill, bumpers and light? Where do you put pitting, et cetera, on those items?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that. Where do you put what?
Where do you, like, if you have pitting on bumpers and light, it says, okay, the fitment, okay, question, street paint, coach work is in the line for fitment of the grill.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Bumpers and light, where do you put pitting, et cetera, on those items?
So you're talking about pitting of the chrome or something like that. And that's not in paint and coach work. That's over on glass lights, chrome trim. And there you've got grill front bumper guards. And if you've got pitting on the grill or pitting on the front bumper, it goes in there. Rear bumpers, tail light section. If you've got pitting on the rear bumpers, it goes here. So the pitting on the chrome is in the glass lights, chrome and trim part. It's an interesting distinction between the fitment and fitment of the bumper is like the bumper's low on one side and high on the other, or the grill isn't quite straight in the car. That's fitment, but the pitting things are over on the other.
Okay. So then here's another good question from Mike Drinkwater about our R134 conversion, right? Which is air conditioning, right? Conversion constitute an originality deduction.
I think we decided not to penalize that.
Okay.
I'm not sure we even put that in the rule book, but I think we decided not to penalize that.
I think it'd be pretty hard to know if the conversion, well, I guess you do know by looking at the.
Yeah, the caps are different.
Yeah, okay. And then I think Bob Best asked, I think, a real good overall question about, we talk about originality versus condition, right? Mm-hmm. And he said he wanted to know if you could give, I guess, a few examples of some of the challenges in originality.
Yeah, Bob, why don't you wait for just a little bit? I'm going to go through pictures and some things like that so you can see that. And if you still have that question, ask after I've gotten through that. But I've intended to go after that with some examples here with pictures.
Okay, and I think Jim and Diane, I think this falls into that category about the quality of body work.
Yeah, I intend to show some examples of that, and there's also some of that in the quiz.
Okay. And we'll cover rock chips. So how do we handle rock chips? Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a common problem.
Yeah. Well, and I've got that in here a little bit later, but I mean, all the cars that are driven on the road are going to probably end up with some rock chips. And so, that ends up under paint and coach work and paint imperfections. And it's really important to balance that appropriately. You can't take off a quarter point for every rock chip on a car that has a number of rock chips, or you'll over penalize it. So you kind of got to put it in the appropriate perspective for the amount of points that are available for that area, which in that case is paint imperfections. You've got a total of 5 points. You've got some rock chips on front of the car. And you can't take off 5 points if the rest of the paint is really, really, really good. And so, that's one of the learning points on this. You got to balance what you take off to the total amount of points in that area and put it in the right perspective and don't over penalize. Mm-hmm. We'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, Todd, hold your question to maybe a little later about the Euro headlights. That's a unique question.
Yeah, I'm gonna cover that. Okay. Let me go ahead and just show you the score sheets. I hope you have some of those printed out in front of you. All right, let's talk show versus street, and this is kind of where we get to talking about the Euro headlights. But as I mentioned, show cars must be more than 25 years old. You judge all 100 points. The instruments are supposed to all be working. often we don't have time to test whether the instruments are all working because of the amount of time we have and the amount of judges we have, but they're all supposed to be working. And in show, we have an expectation that you'll trailer the car if it's showed, not in street. Street, we typically penalize you 2 points if you trailer the car, unless it's a car that is not street legal. Now, street is judged at 92 points, as I mentioned, with 8-point addition for mileage and age. In both of these categories, if you change the paint color on the car, it's a half-point deduction. However, if it's changed to a color that's correct for that year and the model of that car, then it's only a 1/4-point deduction. And some other things in here, black walls or white walls are fine on a car. We don't care whether it has black walls or white walls. But for show class, all 5 of the tires are supposed to match unless it has the original spare. And all the tires must be the original size or a correct optional size for the car. Optional wheels are okay as long as they're available for that year of that car. Badge bars, license plate frames, driving lights are okay on street class, not necessarily on show. MBCA badges or decals are always okay. And street class allows European headlights on cars that did not originally have European headlights. In show class, I said class, I meant category. In show category, you're required to have the headlights that were original to the car. That is, if it's a European market car, it should have the European headlights. If it's a US market car, it should have the US headlights. And for street class, street category, you do not inspect the engine compartment below the body sheet metal. Otherwise, you'd be doing chassis, and you don't do that in street. Okay, so let's give some examples of areas that you might see.
Okay.
So let's consider interior upholstery and trunk. You might see cracked dash. You might see scratched or discolored instruments, especially the needles tend to fade. The instrument bezels, which often have chrome around them, can start getting pitted. The heater control levers are an interesting one, especially on cars built prior to about early 70s. They often have 4 heater control levers in the center of the upper portion of the dash, and they get stiff and they tend to break off. And pagodas are like this, 108s, 109s. Many of the cars have this. I'll show you an example in a little bit. And so look for that they actually have 4 of those levers. You see a lot of aftermarket radios or speakers cut in where there's not supposed to be speakers. The wood finish, especially the more modern cars, the thin laminate wood will tend to crack. And that's less prevalent on the older cars that have the larger pieces of wood. Soft sun visors, 107s are pretty famous for flabby sun visors. 129s tend to have the little plastic piece over where the sun visors go up into the panel crack or fall off. It's not unusual to find stains on headliners, holes in headliners, or for where a soft top has been replaced, you might see some excess glue, since a lot of those are glued around the frames. You also tend to see incorrect upholstery changes, and this is most apparent on a car where the driver's seat has worn to the point where it's reupholstered, and then that leather or that MB texture, whatever it is, doesn't quite match the rest of the car. I have one car like that where we did the seat, the bottom of the seat, black, and all the rest of the black in the car is shiny, and that black isn't shiny. And you can really tell if you're doing the concours judging. And of course, condition of the original upholstery. I'll show an example of leather and what's okay and what isn't okay here in a little bit. Carpet changes, carpet condition, trunk floor and side panel finish. Some of the cars have rubber mats. The older cars have rubber mats in the trunk. You wouldn't expect to see a carpet there. Some of the cars have cardboard side panels in the trunk that tend to break or warp over time. Spare tire and jack, of course, are looked at. The jack, it's not unusual to find a jack that's kind of rusty. Tool kit and first aid kit. And let me mention first aid kit. The cars prior to about 72 are probably not going to have a first aid kit. The later cars, there is a first aid kit delete, an option delete for first aid kit. And so if you're judging a car and you don't see the first aid kit, you might ask the owner, do you have first aid kit delete? Or, tell me about first aid kit or something like that. I actually have a couple of cars that have the first aid kit option delete. Okay, let's look at a few pictures. This one, there's some, see if I can get my cursor over here. Notice that there's some stains on the headliner, and there's actually some stains on the interior in here. And this picture, this is a very nice picture of a period radio, no cracks in the wood. And I specifically want to point out the leather here. Now, there's cracks in this leather, but we refer to that as patina. As long as the cracks aren't through the color code of the leather, it's perfectly fine and doesn't get penalized. And so you see a seat like that, that's okay. If you see a seat and it's very apparent that the cracks are there because you see the original color of the leather beyond it, then that's penalized. Okay, so this one, it's an aftermarket radio. And this is one of the ones that has the 4 levers, but this one only has 3 levers. You can always check clocks. If you check clocks working, check every car in the class. And you basically do that by looking at the time, then coming back a few moments later and see if it's changed and see if it matches the real time. But if you're going to do that, check every car in the class. You must be consistent. In this car, the AC is really not a period correct AC. It's not one of the ones that would have been installed by the dealer. How would you know that? I'm going to show you what I would expect to see on a Pagoda. Now, Pagodas came from the factory without air conditioning. A lot of the US market Pagodas had air conditioning installed by the dealer, and we allow that. And this is what they look like, Coolmeister and Frigid King. And notice there's some similarities between the two. They each have the configuration where it's vent, panel, vent, panel, vent. So you get used to that configuration. You can very quickly look at it and see whether it's one of these or not. All right, let me show you the next one here. Okay, let's consider this picture. Now there is a fairly obvious deficiency here if you're scoring the steering wheel. Note that there's a steering wheel cover. The steering wheel cover is not authentic. Let's consider how you score that. You're in interior upholstery trunk, which has a maximum of 22 points. And down under that, if you look at the score sheet, there's steering wheel, gear shift, signal stalks. That's a maximum of 2 points. Now, if you just look at this thing, okay, there's a steering wheel cover. So you could potentially maybe take off a 1/4 point for that. There's a crack in the steering wheel. If you look over here, hopefully you'll have the resolution in your monitor to see that there's a crack in the steering wheel. And maybe you could take off a 1/4 point for that. There's a bump in this horn pad here, or in this center pad here. So, maybe you could take a 1/4 point off for that. And if you have the resolution to see it, this chrome horn ring here is pitted. And so, maybe you could take a 1/4 point off for that. But if you did that, you'd be taking 4 1/4 points off for just the steering wheel, or a total of a whole 1 point. You only have 2 points to play with in the steering wheel, the stalks, and the gear shift. And so I would say that that would probably be an excessive deduction just for the steering wheel. And so, maybe you might take a couple of 1/4 point deductions, maybe 3 1/4 point deductions, but I think 4 1/4 point deductions is probably excessive for that. And the other way to think about it is, you've got, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to flip that. You've got 3 items that share this 2 points. And so maybe that's 2/3 of a point per item. So you probably shouldn't deduct even 3/4 of a point for the steering wheel alone. The other way to think about it, you've got 2 points here to play with. 1 point is authenticity and 1 point is condition. There's an authenticity deduction of the wrap on the steering wheel. So, that's maybe reasonably a 1/4 point. So you only have then 1 point to play with for condition. And so you start getting, pretty high into that when you start taking off a quarter for the crack, a quarter for the chrome pitting, a quarter for the bump in here, when you haven't even looked at the stalk and the gear shift yet. And so my point in this is you always have to deduct appropriately for the total amount of points in that category. And you always have to think about split 50-50 between condition and authenticity. And of course, you notice this. Oh, I did not mean to do that. You also notice that there is an aftermarket radio here, and that's probably a 1/4 point deduction. That's in the area of dash, instruments, radio, glove box, and center console. If you look at the score sheet, and you only have 3 points to play with there. So you certainly wouldn't want to do more than a 1/4 point for that radio. You've got to look at a whole bunch of other things and spread those points around to a whole bunch of other things than just the radio. And so I caution you, don't over deduct. Always make your deduction proportional to the amount of points you have in that category. All right, so let's go to paint coach work. Here's where we talk about stone chips, and I've already mentioned, to the tune of don't over deduct. You've got 5 points to play with in paint imperfections, but let's say you have 50 stone chips, you certainly can't take a 1/4 point off for every stone chip. You've got to deduct it in proportion to the amount of points on the scorecard. And so if everything else is perfect about the paint, there's no other paint imperfections, and you got some stone chips, you might be taking off a 1/4 or a 1/2, but not a lot more than that if everything else is perfect.
Okay, let's stop here for just a second. I think we got a couple pertinent questions here. One about these stone chips, how to handle them. I think there's different philosophies about filled and, painted in, unfilled stone chips, and the quality of any repairs.
Well, in PCA, the rule is if a stone chip is painted in, then, or, in any way, done well or not, you don't deduct for it. We don't have that rule. So, you can deduct for stone chips, but just don't overdo it.
Okay. And I think another question came up too about, we were talking about color code, and this is a good question about the paint color list. I know we've had one. I don't know how current or how up to date it is. Where can you get a good list?
Well, we've got one on our over in Dropbox, and I was planning to send that out when we send out the after action item.
Okay.
I was thinking that was probably okay.
Well, that's the answer. That's where you can get it.
Yeah, I'll send out what we have when we conclude. Well, are there other questions?
No, those are the two pending ones.
Okay. All right. So some of the other items, it's not unusual to see the lower front valence to be rusty, or chips on the lower front fenders, especially behind the wheels. And the fit of the rocker panels, the fender gaps. Mercedes are so good that when they come from the factory with all the gaps perfect. And so if you see something other than perfection in the gaps, either the cars had some body work that wasn't quite done right, or it's been disassembled and reassembled and they didn't quite align it correctly. The gaps are perfect on Mercedes from the factory. The excessive orange peel and hard to buff places, and I'll show you a picture of orange peel if you don't know what that is. The orange peel in the paint for a car that's repainted, it will typically be buffed out on an earlier car that did not originally have any orange peel. But it's hard to buff places between, say, the grille and the lights or something like that. And so pay particular attention to the areas that might be hard to buff out and see if they didn't quite get the orange peel buffed out. And of course, paint, conditioner chip, paint chips, you'll never see a run on original Mercedes paint, but you could perhaps even see something like that on a repainted car. Scratches, swirl marks, cars that have had a little bit too much pressure applied when polishing them. And then, of course, the correct color for the code tag in reference to the question that we had. Like I said, I'll send out what we have on colors. Now, let me show you orange peel if you don't know what that looks like. I hope your monitor resolution is good enough to see it. It's not this stuff down here. This is poor body work where the Bondo is kind of kind of causing the paint to lift. But up here in the corner, you see that kind of funny thing. It kind of looks like what an orange peel looks like. Well, that's orange peel. But I caution you about orange peel. The older cars don't have orange peel from the factory. But as you start getting, kind of in my experience, mid-90s and earlier, the cars start to have orange peel, and every newer Mercedes has orange peel. And if you have a good high resolution monitor, if you look at this is a 2008 car that was never repainted. And if you look at the reflection in the gas filler cap, it kind of looks like an impressionistic painting. Notice the straight lines are wobbly. This straight tower or pillar here is wobbly. And if you compare it to up here in the glass where everything's straight, I mean, that's orange peel from the factory. So as you start judging cars that are, maybe 95 or newer, you're going to see more and more orange peel, and you really can't penalize that because they came from the factory that way. So be careful with orange peel. If you're judging, say, a Pagoda, it's not going to have orange peel unless it was put on in refinishing. Okay, so more paint and coach work. Compare the left and right fenders fits. Compare the left side of the hood to the right side of the hood to look at the gaps. It's really pretty easy and obvious to see gap issues because of how good Mercedes are from the factory. And this picture down here kind of shows you a left and a right side gap that's not done very well. And often you see a chrome strip on the back end of a door. The car did not come from the factory that way, and that's penalized. Now, Pagoda, I'd say about 2/3 of the Pagodas I've seen don't have this notch. And this is on the inside of the fender. The Pagoda is made so this chrome surround of the light is the same on left side and right side. On the outside of the car, this lines up with the body molding. On the inside, Mercedes built the car so it would have a little, notch in here to match that, just so it would look right. Now, a person that redoes a Pagoda and doesn't know this is here will often sand over it and it will go away. And so when you're judging a Pagoda for paint and coach work, always look to see if that's there. Now, the wheel center cap is typically painted the body color, and you basically never see one that looks like this. In fact, they even sell little masking templates so that you can paint this. But you will basically never see one that looks like the one in this picture. And by the way, the white wall tires are perfectly fine. We don't care whether it's white wall or not. And this one is sight lines. This is a 600. And what I'm trying to show you here is that you have to kind of get down a little lower and see if the line is straight, and also get where you can get a reflection of light off the side of the car, and that'll show you whether you have dings or irregularities in the panel. And this car is very, very good. Also, this car, it's a 600. 600s have fender lip chrome. There are not very many Mercedes that are supposed to have fender lip chrome. In fact, the only ones are the 600, the 300 SE Coupe or convertible from 1962 to 1967, the 300 SC from 1956 to 1958, the 220S or SE Coupe or convertible from 56 to 61. And that's pretty much it. Now, what you see very often is an R107 will have that. And that's not correct for an R107. And I don't see it on too many other cars, but you see it on a lot of R107s. And it's bad. For if it's not designed to be on the car, what you find is they often trap moisture under them and they cause rust under them. So it's a bad thing to have on the car. Okay, here's an area that we actually put in the rules to make it a little easier, because I'm not even sure you can buy these tops anymore. It's not unusual to be judging a 129 or a 107 or even a Pagoda soft top, and the top material looks good, no wear on the top material, plexiglass windows look good, but don't have this in it, the little embossed Mercedes symbol. And It's always how much you take off for that. So we specified an otherwise correct soft top, just missing these embossments, just deduct a quarter point. I think you'll probably find that more and more, because I'm not sure you can buy these with these embossed Mercedes symbols in them anymore. And I mentioned, if you see a safety issue, inform the owner immediately. Now, in this case, this is a tire date code. The date code is the last 4 digits of the DOT number, and the last 2 digits are the year. This is a 2007 tire. The general guidance on tires is throw them away at 10 years in most cases. For this tire, I specifically selected this for the example because look at the sidewall cracking. That's a problem. You don't really want to be driving a car that has tires with this level of sidewall cracks in it. And this is something that you really want to point out to the entrant. This is significant safety issue. All right, let's look at a picture of the side of a car. It's a 1 of 7, of course. And look at the gaps. Front door gap, and the front door gap looks about right. Look at the back door gap. Compare the 2 gaps. Note that the rear door gap is narrower than the front door gap. And also, depending on the resolution of your monitor and the color performance of the monitor, you might note that this fender is a slightly different tint than the door. Okay, so that's, there's just some things you're looking for in paint and coach work. So how much might you take off for that? Well, paint and coach work's a 25-point area. Gaps, doors, hood, deck lid, 2 points max. And so I might take off a quarter point for the door gap. Now, paint color is a 2 points max. Well, the door paint doesn't match the fender paint, so I might take off, maybe a quarter point for that out of the total 2 points. Also notice in this car, there appears to be a lug bolt missing, or maybe the cap for the lug bolt missing. And also in paint and coach work, there's wheels. And so wheels and wheel covers, there's only 1 point there. And so, I might take a quarter point off for that. But if you're in doubt about these gaps, just walk around to the other side of the car and look what it looks like on the other side. Now note the other side looks really good. Note it's also got something missing over here on this tire. But you go back to the previous one, and it's pretty easy to see the rear door gap is not the same as front door gap. Okay. All right, so let's proceed then. This is, you're looking carefully at the side of a car and seeing how the reflection looks. And you see in this car, there's a door ding here, there's a door ding here. And the discussion for these door dings is the same as the discussion for paint chips, in that, you certainly deduct for them, but you can't overdo it. We are at paint and coach work, maximum 25 points. Quality of body work is probably where this ought to go. That's only a maximum of 3 points. So there's 2 door dings, maybe you take off a quarter point for each of them. But if I showed you more of this car probably has 15 door dings on each side. And you can't take off 15 times a quarter point because you'll greatly exceed this area. And so you've got to be judicious about taking off in proportion to the significance of it. If the quality of the bodywork is such that everywhere else it looks pretty good and it's got some door dings, then maybe you take off a half, maybe you take off 3/4, but you don't take off 3 points. And you don't take off more than 3 points, of course. The nice thing about computer scoring is it prevents you from taking off more than the allocated amount for the area. All right, so chassis. In chassis, there's 1 point for each of these items. You're looking at the finish of the front and rear suspension. You're looking at the color codes on the springs. I'll show you pictures of those. The condition of the shocks, whether the shocks have leaks on them, the drive shaft, if you can see it, the flex discs, if you can see them. In most cars you can't. Exhaust system, which you can usually see, the rubber donuts that support the exhaust system, which are often cracked or missing. In the finish of the wheel wells, Mercedes has kind of changed the way it does the undercoating and the bottom of the car through the years. The 1950s cars are probably going to be black under the fenders. As you get to the 70s and 80s, you start seeing You start seeing things like body color under there. 70s may be a kind of medium gray. Body color is maybe 90-ish. So you've got to look at it, look where the car is, and see what, see if it looks right to you. But, for a newer Mercedes, black, shiny black undercoating is not going to be correct. And very often when people do repairs on the bottom of the car, they just, spray shiny black undercoating on it. And except for the older Mercedes, that's not going to be correct. The other thing I want to mention is, I said, if you can see them, and I get back to the notion of, you're essentially laying on a piece of cardboard beside the car. Most Mercedes flex discs are not visible from there, and most Mercedes drive shafts, the center drive shafts, not visible from there. The rear drive shafts generally are. So you've got to be very consistent about looking at the car that you can see least on, and then if you can't see the flex discs on that car, don't judge the flex discs on any car. If you can't see the drive shaft on that car, don't judge it on any car. And springs usually have two sets of color codes on them. So, you certainly don't want to subtract points if you see paint on springs. And just as an example, here's what you might see laying behind a car. And if you look at the score sheet, you see exhaust system is 1 point. Now, half is authenticity and half is condition. And it pretty much looks authentic to me. And in fact, usually on a Mercedes, in the center of the muffler in here, there's probably even going to be a Mercedes part number. So condition wise, there's some rust and it's a little bit dented. You only have a half a point total for condition on this. So, you can't really take off more than about a quarter for what you see here, because otherwise condition isn't so awful. So just be careful. Take off only in proportion to where it stands with the amount of points for that area. Okay, we're going to transition to glass lights, rubber, and chrome trim here. And we've already mentioned pitted chrome. There's also cracked or discolored plastic grill inserts, like W124s, 201s have plastic grill inserts, and you can see ones that are the wrong color. They're generally light gray. You can see pieces missing or broken. Cracked headlight doors. And on a Mercedes, the term headlight door means this piece of plastic that kind of surrounds the outside of the headlight. It's not generally a door that opens up over the headlight. It's this piece of plastic around it. Very prone to cracking or losing pieces or being fitted poorly. We've already mentioned European headlights, which are okay in street class and street category, and in show category have to be what the car came with.
Yeah, let's just stop there. I think Todd
Okay.
had a reverse question here about how about Euro version cars, Euro versus US headlights, the Hilo Bosch. Say a Euro was converted to US versus still had or reverse federal conversion, Euro on a converted federal car. Maybe help me out, Todd, here. I think you're talking about a Euro car that was converted to US. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So Euro with the round headlights.
Let me address that. I think I understand that question.
Okay, well, I don't.
Because you could easily have a Euro car, and a very, very apparent Euro car based on maybe having an engine that isn't available in the US with say a 107 with a 6-cylinder engine, and it shows up at the Concours and has 4 round headlights instead of European headlights. If I were the entrant, I would argue that US requirements require the car to be changed to 4 round headlights. In that case, the judge shouldn't penalize it. There's an exception in the rules for safety requirements and requirements to conform to laws of the United States. And so that is how I would argue that, and I would not penalize that.
Yeah, Austin, I think the answers to Austin's questions about gray market cars, I think it falls in the same vein, right? Gray market cars had to be federalized,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't penalize that. Okay.
Great.
So,
Those are great questions. Thanks, guys.
okay, poor fit of fog lights, turn signal lenses. It's not unusual to see those that are not aligned appropriately. Windshield seals with sunlight eventually crack. Correct windshield. Well, the windshield ought to be an original equipment manufacturer windshield, probably what Sigler or Pilkington. But what I see more often is windshields that have been replaced. And on a Mercedes, there is typically a signature down the lower passenger side corner of the windshield. It's usually a decal. On some of them, it's actually inscribed in the windshield. They've changed through the years, but there's typically something that has a signature on it down there. And what I most often see is the windshield's replaced, but it doesn't have that decal on it. And you can typically buy those decals and put them on, which is what I would do if I were trying to maintain originality on Concours car. I don't see too many that have the wrong decal on. I usually just see them that don't have a decal. Okay, I already mentioned fender lip chrome. Discoloration of rubber side trim tends to turn kind of grayish. Now, for a car that's been painted, not painted particularly well, you can find overspray, you can find glue, you can find the masking lines. Door seals with time develop cracks. Rear lights sometimes end up sagging and not level with the horizontal trim lines. With sunlight exposure, the taillight plastic lenses start to change their color. Sometimes you end up with paint inside the bumpers where the car has been painted and the inside of the bumper wasn't masked, because they won't normally have paint in there. Bumper overriders will usually have some rubber on them, and the rubber often shrinks or gets hard or cracks. Trunk seal will crack. Antenna installation, usually with incorrect antenna installation, it's usually talking about that little rubber seal around it that either is the wrong seal or has cracked and fallen off. And of course, discoloration of any rubber or any of the bumper covers. The bumper covers require a different paint mix than the car, and sometimes they just don't match very well. All right, so let's have a few examples. Now, this is 600. This is a very nice 600. It's very well aligned lights. This is a 280 SE, and it's got chrome trim it's not supposed to have. This is let's see, this one is a US market car with European headlights. As we've said, okay in street category, not okay in show category. And this is a 107 with chrome trim. And it's not supposed to have this chrome trim over the wheels. And for some reason, 107s are the cars that seem to have that. So how much might you take off? Okay, well, you're in side trim, antenna, side mirrors. It's a total of 2 points. Remember, one is condition, one's originality or authenticity. And so let's assume that everything's in excellent condition. And then you've got some chrome wheel arch covers, which are not authentic. You could do a quarter for each, and there's 4 of them, but that would be a total of 1 point, which would be all the points for authenticity in that area. It's probably excessive. Half point might be good, quarter point might be good, but no more than a half. But the other point of this is you've got to be consistent with the other cars in the class. If you come up with another 107 that has 4 of these chrome lip covers, then you've got to take off that same amount. Okay, let's get to my favorite place, which is engine compartment. Now, there's a lot of things that can be deficient in an engine compartment. Leaks, obviously, corrosion, fan. It's not unusual to have a fan clutch assembly that has some corrosion on it. Corrosion on a water pump. A lot of the materials in the engine are aluminum. They tend to end up with little spots from water on them, which are pretty easy to take off. Wrong fan belts. We really expect an original equipment fan belt. Continental or Conti is usually the fan belt we would expect. Probably not Gates. stains on the intake manifold from previous fuel leakage, corrosion on the exhaust manifold, and basically every M116 and M117 engine is going to have corrosion on the exhaust manifold. So just be consistent on the way that you treat that. Brake booster corrosion. Under the master cylinder, if the master cylinder has ever had a brake fluid leak, brake fluid is very corrosive and it'll typically remove the paint under the master cylinder. So you kind of look there and see if if that condition exists. Maybe the engine block's replaced. Honestly, I don't know how to check for that. Wrong color of engine block. You certainly don't expect to see, Ford orange on a Mercedes engine block. Air filters. Some of the air filters are chrome, or not chrome, not chrome. Some of them are aluminum, and it should be the original aluminum finish, not over polished. Some of them are black, and the black is kind of a semi-gloss black. It's not really shiny, and it's not totally dull. Battery. It's not unusual to see the wrong battery. It really is supposed to be a Mercedes battery. If it's after about 72 when Mercedes batteries came out, and it should be a certain battery, which I'll cover in a minute if it's before that. And it's not unusual to see batteries that don't have hold downs on them or that don't fit right. It's not unusual to see ignition wires that are not correct or to have the wrong ends on it. A lot of Mercedes have big, shiny, chromish looking ends that go over the spark plugs. And when those are missing, that's a deficiency. Fuel stains on the injection or carburetors. You usually can't see collapsed engine mounts, but if you can detect it, that's a deficiency. Firewall grommets, there's a lot of places where wires and hoses go through the firewall. They each have rubber grommets around it, and with age, they will crack, and that's deficient. Over polishing of aluminum and metal finishes. Most of the Mercedes that have aluminum valve covers are delivered with kind of a dull metal finish on the valve cover. And it's not that unusual to see people polish them so they look really, really pretty. But most of them didn't come from the factory that way, so that's deficient. Hood pads. Poorly replaced hood pad that tends to sag, or pieces of the hood pad come off, or originally that you can't see the glue. If it wasn't done carefully, the glue becomes visible. And then the yellow cad finish. Cadmium is a preservative plating that's done on certain parts of the car, especially fuel lines, and it will eventually flake off. It can be either replated, or in some cases, folks paint them to make them look that way. And it's not unusual to see the paint be the wrong color or too bright. It is also not unusual to see the finish, the cadmium plating finish, chipping off. Hose clamps. Probably the thing I see most often in an engine compartment is hose clamps that we call Yankee clamps. Those are clamps that have little gaps where the hose can poke through. I will show you a picture of that here momentarily. Black painted components that have the wrong, whether gloss or dull, they're supposed to really be kind of semi-gloss. The inner fenders. The engine compartment on most Mercedes is the same color as the exterior of the car. And if somebody does a paint color change, it's not unusual to either not do the engine compartment because it's kind of difficult to do, or to paint the engine compartment sheet metal black. And if you see that, it probably means there's a color change on the car. Incorrect ignition coil. Most Mercedes ignition coils are really kind of dull and not very colorful. And if you see a pretty colorful one, it's probably not original to the car. Plating and painting on things that aren't supposed to be painted and plated. I'll show you a picture of that in the quiz. Wiring harnesses that are torn and are braided, and hood springs, which are typically body color. And if they've been replaced, they probably won't have been painted. All right, let's go to some pictures of examples. Now, this is an example of what you expect to see. Hose clamps that are totally covered in this area. And if you look down at this clamp, we call these Yankee clamps. This is what you see on American cars, and it allows pieces of the hose to kind of extrude out, and it can cause damage to the hose. And so Mercedes does not use hose clamps like this. And this is probably the thing I see most often in an engine compartment, is this incorrect type of hose clamps. I'll also point out, see how shiny this is? And in here, it didn't come like that from Mercedes. I mean, Mercedes just almost never does that. I was mentioning cadmium plating. Note these fuel lines. This looks good for cadmium plating here on these fuel lines. Okay. This radiator cap is not a Mercedes radiator cap. It's an aftermarket, non-correct radiator cap, and there's some corrosion on top of the radiator here. This is good. This is a Mercedes clamp, and this is a Continental belt. If you look over at this picture, it's an exhaust manifold with some corrosion on it, a head with a block with some corrosion on it, and a hose clamp with some corrosion on it. This is another example of some Yankee clamps, and this is some corrosion on this. Here we have a aftermarket ignition system mounted in the engine compartment. And in this picture down here is just generally dirty. There's dents on the air cleaner. The reservoir here is discolored and dirty. It says Yankee clamps here, which are up here. If you look at this one, it's an aftermarket battery. We would expect this to be probably a Mercedes branded battery. We've got Yankee clamps in it. We've got a K&N sticker up here. I had a car that had a K&N sticker on the air filters. It now doesn't. And there's this grommet in the firewall has a bunch of cracks in it too. Okay. Batteries. There's a lot of discussion about batteries for 190 SLs and 250 or Pagodas. And so I dug up these pictures. This is an original picture of a battery in a 190 SL. The correct 190 SL battery, it's called a tar top battery, and it has exposed intercell conductors. Note there's 6 cells, and these 2 cells are connected here, these 2 cells are connected here, and so on. And you actually can see these connections. And so that's what a 190 SL battery should look like. And there's only 3 manufacturers, Barta, Hopeki, and Bosch. And so something other than that really isn't correct. And this is an original picture of a Pagoda. And this battery is different. It's not a tar top battery. It's an old style battery that has screw caps on the cells so that you can go in and check the electrolyte level. And so this is kind of what a Pagoda battery is supposed to look like. And I think the manufacturers are still the same. This is before Mercedes started selling Mercedes branded batteries. Okay, more engine compartment. Just an example of corrosion and some incorrect sealant in here on this valve cover. Note the CAD plating on these fuel lines, it looks pretty good. And a correct hose for the diesel. This one has oil puddled on the valve cover up here, and the valve cover is really a little bit shinier than it's supposed to be. Okay, more engine compartment. These blue ignition wires are not correct. They're normally black on a Mercedes. And if you look, this is the fan. If you look down at the fan, kind of behind it, you see these bolts, all the heads of the bolts are corroded. All right, so let's just look at this engine compartment and see what we see and what we might deduct. And I chose this because it's a pretty good engine compartment. There's not a lot here to deduct. You can really go down the rabbit hole of talking about engine compartments because there's so much detail in an engine compartment. This is a 560 SL. And so as we look through it, it's really a pretty good car. What you see is a coolant reservoir that's discolored. And so let's look at our score sheet. We're in the engine compartment. It's a 25-point max. Under coolant system, there's 2-point maximum. And so we have a discolored coolant reservoir, which is condition. So let's take off a 1/4 point for that. And the only other thing I really see on this car is if you look at the brake fluid reservoir, note that the brake fluid is black. This car came from the factory with brake fluid that was pretty much transparent. And so I would take off, if you look at the braking system 2 points max, I'd probably take off a 1/4 point for the brake fluid. And this is one that it kind of gets into safety issue, I would probably mention to the entrant that he should have his brake fluid changed. Mercedes specifies for most of the cars changing brake fluid every 2 years. And if you change it every 2 years, it won't look like that. Now, the other thing to note about this car, look what the aluminum looks like on the air cleaner. That's about right for this car. If a person shines it too much, it'll be all really, really shiny. If you don't touch it at all, it ends up being kind of cloudy. And so this is about what it ought to look like. Okay. But what about things that aren't on the score sheet? If it's not on the score sheet, but it's not as it came from the factory, do you still take off for it? Well, the answer is yes, but you have to figure out where to take off for it. And so some of the things that are not on the score sheet. Well, the air cleaner and the induction pipes really aren't on the score sheet. The engine compartment score sheet has miscellaneous items not covered. That's a good place for it. The windshield wipers are not on the score sheet. So, a good place for that is windshield seal and trim. And one of the things you'll often see is for the older cars, the windshield wipers are housed in shiny, kind of aluminum-ish, not really chrome, but aluminum-ish covers in the or frames. And the newer replacements are black, and so the black is deficient, and that's fairly frequently seen on 109s, 108s, 107s. Belts, if it's got a American Gates belt, it's probably deficient. Where do you put that? Well, in the engine compartment, there's a number of systems. You can put it under the system that the belt serves, or you could use miscellaneous items not covered.
I got a good one here. Hey, Gary, got a good one here to add to this list. I don't know that I've ever seen this. Austin from Triangle asked about auto to manual swaps, automatic to putting manual transmission in.
Well, most Mercedes do not ever come with manual transmissions other than some of the European models. If it was a swap where it put in a transmission that was available as an option for that car, would anyone really know? And
well, that's what I would say. How would you know? I mean, if
Yeah.
it was obvious, if the car never came as a as a manual.
If it never came with that, then that's a deficiency, and it needs to be deducted for. You'd have to find a good place to put it. Maybe miscellaneous items not covered would be a good place for that. If you're really worried about that for a specific car where it's really obvious, custom class might be a good place for that car. Yeah, that's a good question then. I've never
seen it, but I'm
sure
it happened somewhere.
I've got a question a lot like that on the quiz. But so here's one you don't see very much, except on certain of the cars: improper ride height. Where do you put that? Well, there really isn't a place on it unless you're doing show category and doing chassis and underbody, and then under suspension, springs, and shocks where you put it. So there really isn't a place to take off for that unless you're in show. But above all, especially with these things, they're not on the score sheet, but for everything else too, be consistent in the way you do things. If you see the same deficiency on two cars in the same class, you need to take off the same amount for it, and you need to take it off in the same place. Okay. Any questions on that section before I move to what is actually the last slide in the presentation? No, okay. All right, so this is the last slide in the prepared presentation. I'll address any questions and we'll take a short break and then we'll do the quiz. But in summary, the three basic points for this whole presentation, and I've been trying to really emphasize it: consistency is vital. You've absolutely got to be consistent in the way you score cars. The other of the major points, the points are split generally between authenticity and condition, and you've got to be very cogent about thinking through deducting points in proportion to the maximum points for that area. And it's really easy to over penalize and deduct too many points. Now, remember what we're after here. We want entrants to come back the next time. So we got to treat them that way. Thank them for bringing their cars. Be very transparent about the way we judge. Make sure we write down, what we're taking off for, and make sure it's reasonable and understandable. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Be pleasant and welcoming to our entrants. Don't be grousing about their car in a way that they can hear. Good, consistent, fair judging is absolutely vital to making this program work. Now, I tried to give you the tools to do that, and I hope I've been effective in doing that. I'm really glad to take any of your questions right now, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll go to the quiz. Do we have any questions?
Do you have any questions from anybody? You can go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask your questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Corey.
This is Corey Longstreet from the Triangle section. If you have a car being judged and it has under 50,000 miles, does it not get the 4 bonus points or up to 4 bonus points?
It gets, well, maybe I'll answer this. It gets 1 bonus point for every 50,000 miles. So if you're under 50,000, depending on whether you're manually scoring it or if you're using a computerized scoring system, that I would take it out in my spreadsheet, they would get a partial because I take it out to 4 decimal places.
Yeah, that's really the intent of the rules, to divide the mileage by the scored mileage and come up with like 3 digits and add that in. So it wouldn't be 1 point, but it may be 0.8 or something like that.
Remember, low mile cars are usually more attractive than the high mile cars, right?
Well, remember,
depending, but that's the whole idea behind the equalizer is an older car with more miles and everything is harder to keep in a perfect condition.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah, and remember that question is for a street category car. That doesn't happen in show category. And of course, to be in show category, you have to be more than 25 years old. But I encourage anybody that has a car that's eligible for show category, go into show category. You don't end up with the issue of 21 years versus 0 years and how many points you get for that. The other thing I'll add on that is in street category, if you have combined classes so that you have cars that are 24 years old and classes with cars that are 1 year old, it'll be very hard for the contestants to feel like they've been treated fairly by that addition of points. And so I encourage you to as you're setting up a concours, think through how you're combining classes. I am probably the only person in MBCA that really doesn't like to combine classes. Now, I kind of grew up in PCA concours, and in PCA, you almost never see classes combined. If I were doing it myself, I would never combine classes. And that helps get rid of that issue of having 23-year-old cars in classes with 1-year-old cars.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Ken.
On my C300 Cabriolet, I had the bra installed. Now, I don't really plan on entering any contest, but should I ever enter a contest, that is supposed to prevent rock chips and everything else. Would that actually be a negative? Because you can see a fine line. It's the whole hood is covered, but not the whole front bumper. So you could actually see a fine line where this bra is, clear bra is installed. Would that be something that would be noticeable to the judges and a deduction or a disregard? What would that be?
Well, let me ask you, was the clear bra installed by the factory?
No.
Okay, well, it didn't come from the factory that way. So there is a deduction for that. Now you got to think about, if you didn't have the clear bra installed, you'd probably have a bunch of stone chips.
Gotcha.
And there'd probably be, a quarter point, half point, something like that for stone chips, versus the clear bra, which might be maybe a quarter point for having a clear bra. And so it's, in some ways, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, but you're probably better off with the clear bra than you are with the stone chips. But in general, if it didn't come from the factory that way, it's penalized. I don't think it's going to be penalized a lot. And a number of manufacturers provide the cars with the clear bra.
Yeah, I think here's a good question from Austin. I know, I'll give it to you, Gary, and I think you can answer it. How are Brabus, Lozier, and pre-AMG merger cars judged since they are aftermarket packages? Are they penalized?
Yeah, you don't see that very much. And the challenge on those cars is the pedigree. How do you really know if the car came from the factory? Well, those cars didn't come from the factory with those. We have no provision in the rule book for making exceptions for that. So
They
you know,
kind of go into that custom category,
Yeah.
or we've done it where we had enough of them at Peachtree that we created a class
Mhm.
for them alone. So they all competed together. So
Yeah, that's a good car for custom category, I'd say. And if you were making the case that it was really a pre-merger AMG car, it sometimes gets a little hard to prove that that's really the case, especially when you're trying to buy the car or something like that. So I mean, that's a difficult thing, but you don't see those cars very often either.
yeah, this is a good question from our PCA. 107 is being judged and certified as Silver Star. Can you still enter it in the car in street or show? The answer is absolutely yes. You can. Silver Star is something separate but has no bearing about which class you show or which category you show it in the show.
Yeah, you can certainly do that. And if I have some Silver Star cars that aren't competing in the classes, as head judge, what I'll do is take one of the teams that finishes early and ask them to go do the Silver Star. If the Silver Star car is competing, of course, you do the judging and then come back and do it as Silver Star. There's not a timeline for Silver Star. There is for judging. That's why I will typically always do those last. I did not talk about Silver Star in this presentation. It's in the rule book and it's really pretty straightforward. There's 3 pages of Silver Star form. One of them is instructions. You find all the people that want to do Silver Star. You give them those 3 pages and ask them to fill out the owner's portion of the pages. They then go to one of your judges. The judge reviews it with them. And if the judge agrees with the scoring, then signs it, brings it to the chief judge. The chief judge reviews it, signs it if they agree, takes a picture, and sends the form and the picture to the National Business Office, who issues the Silver Star certificate. Excuse me. That's generally how that works.
Okay, here's a couple of questions. I think, Kevin, about we've talked about this computerized scoring system. That is a third-party tool. It's called Car Show Pro that we've used. It really is not, I'll call it certified by MBCA per se. We're not saying you have to use that. You can go use it yourself if you want. You can contact the owner, and he's quite familiar with our setup, and they already have our score sheets already loaded, so they could help you load those up. We also used it at Legends of the Autobahn East. So that's how you get access to the computerized scoring system. And then Todd, I think, what's your question about Sprinter van, work van? What about work vehicles such as a Sprinter used for tire service? I'm not sure.
Well, I'd like to hear that question more specifically from him. Todd, if you'll ask that question. I'm not sure I understand it.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Go ahead.
So we had a little concours this last summer, or actually just a couple of months ago, and there was a fascinating tire service on wheels Sprinter van, and he wanted it judged. And so he had a work vehicle. It was, I mean, in exceptional condition considering it was an active work vehicle, but I had no idea how to treat the interior as it was a full operational tire service vehicle. So it was a work vehicle, but he wanted it judged as a car. Very unusual, but again, I thought it was really cool, and I wasn't going to turn him down.
Well, I would certainly be accepting. I'm sitting here looking at the classes to see where we put sprinters. I'm sure we put sprinters in here someplace. Yeah, sprinters are in class 19. And they're in class 19 with Unimogs and Vitos. So and sprinters are pretty much, run the gamut from RVs to work vehicles to vans. And some of them came from the factory as, bare cabin chassis. So it's an interesting place to be. I also don't think you're going to see very many, and I would certainly welcome them in. I would also have a hard time judging a sprinter against a Unimog, but that would be another interesting challenge because Unimogs run the gamut. But yeah, I think I'd probably take it as it is.
I just felt that, I mean, it was worthy of getting judged because the van as a work vehicle was extremely well kept. And the interior, considering it was an active workshop, I mean, was as good as many, wonderfully operating, repair shop interiors. So I didn't know how to, and it was it was a unicorn. So I
Yeah.
really, I didn't really put it with the rest of the cars, but I certainly gave it kudos as a judge's choice because, hey, you don't see these things judged.